Good morning, everyone. I'm Adhithi Ravichandran, and I'm a software consultant, author, and speaker. I'm based off Kansas City, and today I'm going to be talking to you about consuming a GraphQL API with Apollo client and within a React application. First, I'd like to thank All Things Open for having me here today, and I really look forward to presenting this talk. I'm also really glad that they made it virtual because I'm currently not in the United States, so it's really convenient for me to give this talk virtually. I hope everyone's been safe during this pandemic and having a good time at All Things Open. So for this talk, the prerequisite is to know some basics of GraphQL and JavaScript. And I'm going to be using React, which is a library that is on top of JavaScript. So I do have a course on Pluralsight called GraphQL, the Big Picture, which basically introduces you to the fundamental concepts of GraphQL as a technology. And it teaches you how to write queries, mutations, and so on. So if you're new to GraphQL, I definitely recommend you taking this course if you have Pluralsight. And in this talk, we're going to be talking about what is Apollo Client. And we're going to set up React and Apollo Client and combine them together within our application. And we're also going to learn about how to write queries to retrieve data from a GraphQL server and write mutations to modify or update data back to the GraphQL server. So the Apollo client. Before we talk about the Apollo client, just to give you a quick summary on GraphQL, GraphQL is basically just a query language for APIs, and it gives you clients the power to ask for exactly what they need and nothing more. So the queries that you write with GraphQL are tailor-made by the client, and it could be different per client. Making it easier for you to evolve APIs over time. And it definitely comes with a lot of powerful developer tools as well. On that note, what Apollo Client does is it basically leverages the power of GraphQL and it handles the data fetching and data management for you. It's basically a tool that you use to make your developer experience really seamless when you're using GraphQL. Some insights of how Apollo Client really works. So let's say we have our UI, which is for Apollo Client, the good news is it's framework agnostic. So it doesn't care if you use Vue, React, Angular, or even iOS. And from your UI layer, you basically send a query. And instead of directly sending it to the GraphQL server, you send it to the Apollo client. And the Apollo client processes this query and it sends the request to the GraphQL server along with that query. Now our GraphQL server sends the response back to the Apollo client. And here the Apollo client normalizes and stores the data and sends it to the presentation layer, which is our UI, and it automatically updates our UI. So a lot of the heavy lifting is really done by the Apollo client. It takes care of things like caching. It takes care of even updating our UI. So from the UI point of view, it's extremely convenient to use Apollo client for your GraphQL requests. So some more additional points on why Apollo client. Now, Apollo client comes with what's called the declarative data fetching. Now, the declarative data fetching is basically a concept where it uses these hooks to fetch data and to update data. And the hook does a lot more than just data fetching. It takes care of updating you with loading status, with error status, and all of these are encapsulated within that hook, making it very easy for you to consume the Apollo client and make use of just simple hook to send queries to the GraphQL API. The other reason why Apollo client is quite popular is because it's a great fit for modern UI frameworks like we talked about, because it's framework agnostic and heavily used in React, Vue, Angular, and so on. It also provides intelligent caching and if you're going to call the same query twice, it's already cached the results from the previous query, so it wouldn't have to hit the server again unless something is changed. And it's also compatible across any build setup and GraphQL API. So you could have your GraphQL API written in pretty much any language, and your Apollo client can still talk to it. And it also comes with lots of modern tools, and the developer experience thus is pretty cool. Some of the Apollo tools that you could use are the Apollo client's dev tools. There's a tool called CodeGen, and also the ESLint plugin for GraphQL. There's also additional tools with AppSync, AWS, and even the Apollo Storybook Decorator. So all of this is open source. So when you go to Apollo GitHub repository, you would find all of these repositories, excuse me. And last but not the least, the Apollo community is an active, growing community. So we see a lot of engagement within the community. So if you're stuck in a problem, if you need some help, there are members within the open source area for Apollo and GraphQL that would definitely help you out. So which is also a big win to use Apollo client. Now, getting into our application, what we're going to be doing today is I have this application called Globomantics, and it is a conference app. And what this really does is display conference sessions and speakers information. We're going to work on our front end, and the front end of this app is coded in React. And we have this new GraphQL API server. And we don't need to worry about coding that server or any of that because it's already available to us. Our plan is basically to consume this new GraphQL API for our data needs. And we have APIs available for the conference sessions, speakers. We can even pick a favorite session and so on. So we're going to just explore how we can do these basic retrieval of data and updating data using Apollo GraphQL. And our app is going to display these conference sessions. It's going to be allowing us to feature a session or favorite a session, and also display speaker information. All right. So first things first is setup. So I'm going to show you how our application is set up today. So I will send a link to where you can find this. This is all available in my GitHub repository. You can find me on Adhithi Ravi GitHub, and you can see the consuming GraphQL API repository. And I would definitely post links to that after the talk as well. So our folder structure is where we have this API folder followed by the app folder. API is where we have our server code, and we don't need to worry about any of that. Our schema is also present within the API server. So this is our GraphQL schema. And there's not much we can do here. We're not planning to do anything here. Our data files, which is basically our sessions.json and speakers.json, are present here as well. And that's the JSON file, which is basically served in our GraphQL server, which our app is going to read. The app is where all of our real stuff is happening, which is the React application here. And within the source folder, you would see a pages folder, and within that, there's a conference folder, and we have sessions and the speakers page. Now, to get this all set up, first things first, we have a package.json file at the root. So I'm going to open the terminal, and we would need to do npm install at the root level. And once that's done, I'm going to go into the API folder and do an npm install there as well. And I'm going to get into the app and run another installation there. It's going pretty fast for me because I probably have all of this installed already. Now, once you install your dependencies, the next thing we're going to do is to start our application. So I'm just going to run npm start. Seems like it's already running. And this is our Globomantics conference application. Nothing fancy here. I do have a conference tab where we have two tabs, the view speakers and a view sessions button. Clicking on view speakers is going to pull the speaker information. And all of this is coming from our GraphQL API server. And clicking on view sessions is going to get me the sessions that we need. Right now, it's going to show error because we didn't wire up the data yet. And that's where we're at. And our server is currently running at localhost 4000. And when you open localhost 4000, you'll see the GraphQL playground, which is this, that's running. Now, let me go back to the slides to see if there's, yep. So first things first, once you have this application running, you already have Apollo client installed because it's part of our package.json file in the app. But if you're integrating Apollo client within your existing application, make sure to install at Apollo/client and also install GraphQL. So the Apollo client is basically the main package that you need, which contains everything you need to set up Apollo client. Today it's in version 3 plus. I think they also have a release candidate for version 3.5. And the GraphQL package, that provides you the logic for parsing GraphQL queries. All right. And you can see all of these available within our package.json file. You will see the Apollo client, and we'll also see there's React. And I also have Apollo Code Gen and GraphQL. But at the bare minimum, you would at least need the Apollo client and the GraphQL package. Okay. Another thing that when you're integrating Apollo within your React application or any other UI application is you need an apollo.config.js file. So this is where you're going to tell your client where the server is really running. So here we tell the client within this object here where you have a service, and in that you provide the URL. In our case, the URL is localhost 4000. And this is what connects your client to the server. So this config file is absolutely needed. Now, if we go into the localhost 4000, I've written a simple query here. This is a GraphQL query where I'm querying for the conference sessions. There's an object called sessions and a field called sessions. And we're querying for the ID, title, and some more information for that session. When you hit the play button, you're going to get the response back from our API that's running. And this is in the format of a JSON format. You can see every single data item that we ask for comes back. So we see within the sessions array, we see ID, title, the timing, day, room, and so on. And we also have the speaker information. So when we want to learn a little bit more about our schema or want to know more about the queries and mutations that are available, we can always open on the very right, you see the docs. Here is where you see what queries are available to you. So we also have queries for speakers. You can click on that and you can see what we need to, what are the fields that you can query for. We also have mutations, like mutations to create new sessions, mutations to mark a speaker as featured, and so on. So you can do a lot more with this API than what I'm going to show you in this talk. So feel free to take my code from my repository and play around with this if you feel so. All right. So the next thing that we look at with integration of our Apollo client is the creation of an Apollo client. So we need to initialize our Apollo client's instance and provide it to the GraphQL server URL. So in this case, where we're providing the server URL and we're initializing it at the root of our app, and we initialize it with the keyword new. I can show how we do that in our actual code in the app.jsx file. So in here, you can see we're initializing our Apollo client. And the cache that we're going to use is an automatic cache that comes with Apollo client out of the box. So we're going to call that the in-memory cache. And in here, we're also using the link. We're passing the link using the HTTP link object. We're going to initialize that and pass to it our server link. So this is all one-time setup that you need to do to integrate Apollo client within your React application. And once that's done, the next step for you is to use the Apollo provider and wrap it around the root of your application. So the reason we do that is basically, if you're familiar with React, you know that we use context, right? Just like we use providers to use context, give context to the rest of the components, we do the same with the Apollo provider. You connect your Apollo client to React using this provider component, and it basically wraps the entire React app and places your client on the context. And that allows access for all of these GraphQL functionality from all the components. So if you don't need it at the root level, you can choose at what level you want to use your Apollo provider. But in this application, I'm using it at basically the root level. And with that, we're now ready to start consuming the GraphQL API from our client. So first things first is basically queries. So as we talked about, GraphQL is really efficient about fetching data, and it fetches data that the client really asks for. So the power here is on the client. The client can ask for simply what they need to update their UI, and that's exactly what they get. Now, another interesting thing about GraphQL queries is that you can combine all of this data even within a single request, which is really cool because you can have multiple things you're querying for, and you can combine them as one single request to your GraphQL server. And as we already talked about, all of these queries are tailor-made per client. So for the Apollo client, since it uses the model of declarative data fetching, it uses this hook called the useQuery hook. Now, this useQuery hook is basically a React hook. If you're familiar with React, you're also familiar with hooks. It's just like any other React hook, but it comes with Apollo client. And this is the API that you use for executing queries in an Apollo application. So let's take a look at how we do that. I'm gonna get into our pages, conference, and sessions here. So there's a lot of code that I've already pre-written here. And I'm gonna skip through some of them because we don't need to know every single thing here. A lot of this is also UI code. So this is where my sessions page begins. I have this sessions component, which basically displays a few buttons. We have, let me get to our site. This is our sessions page, and we have these buttons that I'm going to use for filtering sessions. So I have Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and something that's going to display all the sessions for me. And that's pretty much all this UI work over here. And depending on which button I click, I'm going to set that day, and I'm going to use the state hook to save the state of whatever button the user has clicked. And in here, I'm going to call this component called all sessions list. Now this component, let's see what it does. So I already have written a GraphQL query here, which needs a little update. All right. So this is a simple GraphQL query, which basically mimics what we already wrote in our GraphQL playground. It basically is all queries need the keyword query, and I'm going to query the sessions field, and I'm asking for ID, title, and some more information that I need about that conference session, including the information about the speaker's name, ID, and so on. And we use the keyword GQL that comes with Apollo client to define our query. And I'm using a const, and I'm going to say this is called all sessions. Now I'm going to plug in this query within our useQuery hook. So I have a function, which is also a component which renders each session item. So in here, this is pretty much all I need to do to call this query and execute this query. I use this useQuery hook and pass to it the query we just wrote, which was the all sessions query. And it returns to us three things. It returns to us the loading status, the error status, and the data object. So if your query is still executing, then Apollo client returns true for this loading status. If it is loading, then you can decide what to do with your UI. You can show a spinner, you can just display text like what I have. That's up to the UI. And for some reason, if there's an error, it's going to display an error message. You can have that option as well, because your use query is going to return the error field, error status as well. And finally, if your data executed, the response is stored within this data. In our case, our data contains the sessions, and within the sessions, we're going to have display all of these items. We want the ID, title, and so on. So if you go into the session item component, which I have right here, I've extracted all the data that I need from the session. I need ID, title, day, room, level, start, sat, and speakers. And pretty much all I'm doing here is displaying it, and these are styles that come along with it. So that's kind of what is happening behind the scenes here. If you go back to our sessions, and if you inspect, and if you go into the network tab, I'm going to just refresh this page and click on all sessions. So you can see there was a GraphQL call here, which returned a success. And if we go into our payload, you can see what exactly we requested. So we have the name of our query. You can see the name of our query is sessions, and we're asking for ID, start, sat, day, speaker name, and so on. So all of this information is out here. And the response we got back is available in the response tab. As you can see, it's within the data object, and all of the information about our session is sent back here. And all we're doing now is basically parsing this JSON back and displaying it to our UI. There's nothing fancy going on here, except we're just displaying some information by parsing that JSON. Simple enough, isn't it? Now, there's more that we can do here. Our query right now was a fixed query. We queried for specific fields, and we got the JSON response back, and we displayed them. There are more things you can do with a GraphQL query. For instance, you can pass arguments to your queries. And a reason why you may need an argument could be to filter out the resulting data. And every field and nested object can get its own arguments in GraphQL queries. Now, a good example for that would be something like we had these buttons where we were displaying Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And what if I wanted to filter the sessions, based on those days? Right now, I'm getting all of the sessions back. And what if I wanted to just see some sessions based on a specific day? So we could code something like that pretty quickly. I'm going to copy the previous query and tweak it a little bit. So instead of all sessions, I'm going to call it sessions by day. And in here, to our sessions query, we're going to pass an argument. And our argument is not going to be a fixed day, right? It's going to be a variable, because it depends on what the user is going to click on. The user could click on any button. So I'm going to give permission to add a variable called day. And it's going to be of type string, and it can't be null. By using this exclamation mark within your query, you're specifying that it cannot be null. So you need to pass a day here. And to our sessions, we're going to then pass the day. And our query is basically ready now. It's very similar to the all sessions query, except we're going to now filter by day. Now what I'm going to do is I already have these buttons set up to filter by day. And I have a component that I'm going to write called the sessions list, because we already had what's called the all sessions list. And we're going to write a similar component called session list. So I'm going to copy our all session list component entirely and tweak that a little bit to match our session by day. And this session list component is basically going to take the day. So that's what we're going to call. And this time, we're not going to use the all sessions query. Instead, we're going to use the sessions by day query. But we still need to pass that variable to this query here while we're using the use query hook. So we use a keyword called variables. And to that, we're going to pass the day that was passed to this function. Simple enough. This was the only tweak we had to do. I can talk about it again. We're basically using our use query hook, and to that we're passing the new query that we just wrote. And that query is going to filter the session by day. And it takes in the variables, and the only variable that we've passed to our query right now is the day of the week. And our session list component has already been passed the day of the week, which was in the state. And that's pretty much all we need to do. Let's see if it worked. I'm not a fan of live coding, but let's see. So our all sessions going to show you everything. And there you go. It seemed like it worked. Our Wednesday sessions, clicking on that is going to only display sessions for Wednesday. And our Thursday sessions would only display sessions for Thursday. And the Friday sessions would only display Friday. So what we basically did right now was using variable arguments were passed to our query, and depending on what is passed to it, the query would change, and we would filter based on whatever day of the session is. Isn't it that cool? So an interesting thing, I don't know if you noticed, is I'm going to refresh this page again, and let me click on one of these tabs. You'll notice that it takes a fraction of a second to display the results. So I'm clicking here, you saw a small loading, the loading message displayed, and then you saw the sessions. Now, when I'm going to keep clicking over the same button, you don't see that happen anymore. So when I click on Wednesday, there is no loading anymore. When I click on Thursday, there's no loading. It's instant. This is because of the caching that Apollo client comes with. It has cached the query results. So unless you refresh this page, it's going to keep pulling the results from the cache, making it really fast because nothing has changed from the data perspective. And our button clicks right now are seamless. There's no loading at all. Isn't that neat? And we didn't have to do anything to implement this cache other than just declare the in-memory cache object that comes out of Apollo client. Cool. Now, we talked about arguments, we talked about variables. We saw how arguments can be dynamic in our case, where the day of the week was dynamic, and GraphQL does use variables to query for dynamic values all the time. Another topic we can talk about is handling errors. So we saw how our GraphQL query returns back the loading status and the error status. So that's the error status that we can use to display error messages or notify to the user that something's gone wrong. And errors are common. Whenever you make network calls, you're prone to errors. It could be because your query itself could be incorrect. Your server may not be responding. It could be down. There could be network issues. There are plenty of reasons why errors could come. And our use query returns a result object with the error and loading as properties, which is really cool. So you don't have to go looking for the error. You don't have to search for it. You just know it errored out, and you can let your users know that's happened. All right. Now, another important concept of GraphQL is called fragments. And fragments are basically, you can think of them as functions. So whenever you have a large query that you're planning to reuse in multiple places, you can plug in a fragment. You can paste all of that code or all of that query in a fragment and reuse that fragment. So it's essentially just like a function in a programming language. Fragments are like functions, and they're reusable units in GraphQL. And it can build sets of fields and reuse them across multiple queries. So let's see how we can do that. If you remember, we do have queries that we've been reusing quite a bit. So there's the sessions by day, and the all sessions pretty much have the same query. It's all looking for the session information. So this is a good candidate where we can use fragments. I've already defined a fragment here. Our fragment is basically going to be called sessions attributes. And it again uses the GQL keyword from Apollo client. And it also uses a keyword called fragment. And that's like, just like you would say function, a keyword, fragment is a keyword. And we're naming our fragment session info. And to the fragment, we also need to tell on which object this fragment's being created. So in our case, it's on the session. And we pretty much have the same fields that you see here. Now our fragment is defined, and we just need to utilize this fragment. So our fragment's called session info. And We can get rid of all of these and basically just destructure the session info here. And we need to tell which fragment we're calling. So our fragment was called session attribute. The const given to us was session attributes. So after making this change, you shouldn't see any changes in the UI. So our all sessions should still work. So let's try that out. And yep, there is no UI change here, but our query and lines of code have reduced and it's simpler. So let's also replace the same thing within the sessions by day. We can just use the fragment and we can let them know which, let this query know which fragment it is. So we reduced a lot of lines of code. And the good news is that if you're going to change this query, you don't need to go change it in multiple places. You just go to your fragment and update it. And it should automatically reflect across all the queries that use it. So let's go back to our queries. Yep, everything seems to be working just fine, along with just using a fragment. All right. So next thing up that I'd like to discuss is aliases. So one thing to note is if you have a query and you want a query for the same field but with different arguments, that's a time when you can use what's called aliases. Because GraphQL queries will error out and they will have conflicts if you query for the same field with different arguments. And alias is basically a trick where you rename the result of your field to whatever you want. So this helps to have your consistent JSON and you won't have duplicates. And this will get rid of any conflict in your query, basically. So an example for that would be something like, let's say in our Globomantics application, you see there are levels. We have intermediate levels and advanced levels. And introductory and overview levels. You could filter by these levels or you could sort these levels because right now it's all jumbled up. And what if you wanted to just sort them? To do things like that, you're going to pass the level as an argument, but you have multiple levels you're going to pass. So you may want to utilize something like an alias to do that for you. A good example of using an alias would be in here. Let's say I want to pass a level here. I'm going to hard code a level. And I say I want only introductory and overview. And I also want another one where I'm saying I want intermediate as well. When you do this, GraphQL is going to error out because it's pretty much the same query, but you're passing two different arguments. That's where you would use something like alias. So I'm going to call this object as intro, and I'm going to call this as intermediate. When you do that, it's you get back a clear JSON response. You're going to have intro and intermediate separated out, so you wouldn't have any conflicts in your GraphQL. You can explore this topic after this talk because we're kind of running out of time. So I'm going to move on to the next item. All right. The next thing we're going to look at is basically mutations. So we talked about queries. We learned about how you can pass arguments, variable arguments. You can write fragments for your queries that you can reuse. You can also use aliases if you have the same argument with multiple values you're passing to a query and so on. Mutations are also equally important. And mutations basically can create, update, and delete your data. And mutation fields run in series one after the other. And the Apollo cache, an interesting thing to note about the Apollo cache and mutation is that if you have one field that you're mutating, just one item, then your Apollo cache is going to get automatically updated. But if you're going to have complex mutations, then you'll have to manually update your Apollo cache because it would get complex for it to update multiple items. So that's one thing to note about Apollo client. Just like the use query hook, we have what's called the use mutation hook. And the use mutation hook is also React hook. And that's the API that we use for executing GraphQL mutations. Let's take a quick look at an example mutation code. It's slightly different from the use query, and it's a little bit more complicated than the use query. So we have this use mutation hook where we pass in the mutation that we wrote. So in our case, our mutation was add to do. And instead of the query keyword, we use the mutation keyword. And it's interesting that a mutation, the use mutation hook returns a mutate function. So here, the add to do that you see here is basically a function that you can call at any time to execute the mutation. So whenever your user takes an action, let's say they fill a form and update the data or click a button, scroll, whatever their action is that changes the data, that's where you would, when they take that action, that's where you would call this mutate function. So let's take an example from our code and see what we can do. And also an object with fields that represents the current status of the mutation is also sent to you. In our case, that's the data. And that's very similar to the use query hook. All right, let's take a look at an example mutation. So I'm going to open up the speakers page here and show you how that looks in our Globomantics app. The speakers page is very similar to the sessions page. We have a query to retrieve speaker data. And the mutation that I want to try to demonstrate here is there's a button called featured speaker. Now clicking on that is going to mark this speaker as featured and turn this button, the star, yellow. And that's just what our mutation is going to do. So let's see how we can do something like that. I have a fragment, all of that very similar to the sessions page. The speakers page looks almost exactly like the sessions page. And here's where I have defined our mutation. So our mutation is going to be called featured speaker. And I'm going to call the mutation as mark featured. That's the mutation that we're going to be invoking. And to it, we pass two arguments. One is a speaker ID, and the other is the Boolean that represents whether that speaker is going to be featured true or not featured false. And these are all required fields, and it's going to return back an ID, and that's the data it returns back. Now, this featured speaker is what we're going to call within our use mutation hook. And this use mutation hook, as we talked about, returns a mutate function. And this mark featured function is going to be called anytime you click this button. So in our case, the button is going to be clicked here. I have a button component and I have an async await function. That's how we're going to call this mark featured mutate function. And to our mutate function, we're going to pass in variables. We know the mandatory variables we need are speaker ID. And I'm going to say true for featured because anytime I click that button, it's going to be a featured speaker. So let's see how that works in action. So I'm going to click featured speaker. And notice nothing really happened right now. And I don't see any yellow. So I marked Sean Burns as a featured speaker. So I'm going to refresh this page and come back to Sean Burns. And yep, there you go. Sean Burns, the speaker, has been marked featured and our mutation has worked correctly. But notice I had to refresh this page. And you're going to think, is there a way to see the updated featured speaker without refreshing that page? And the answer is yes, you can. It's a simple addition that I need to make to this mutation. Our mutation originally only returned the ID. To that, I also need to return the field that I mutated. If we return the featured Boolean as well, you'll see that the cache gets updated instantly and we don't need to refresh our page. So let's go back to our Globomantics app. I'm going to mark my Michelle Foster as a featured speaker. And you see the mutation was instant. And if you don't believe me, if you think I'm just clicking buttons and seeing yellow, you can always get back to the network tab and click on another featured speaker and you see this GraphQL call. And we saw the response. The response here tells us this speaker with this ID has been marked featured. And you can also look at the request if you would like. It's going to basically be the speaker ID with the featured tag true. So what was cool about this is GraphQL updated the cache instantly. But as we talked about earlier in our slides, this is not going to always happen. If your mutation modifies multiple entities or if it creates or deletes entities, then the Apollo cache is not automatically updated. Instead, you need to manually update the cache. And that's something you can learn from the Apollo documents. Or I'm also adding a link to another course of mine where I talk about it, because we're kind of running out of time to display how to do that. So keep that in mind, because only the simple mutation of one field can be done instantly to update the cache. And with that, it's a wrap. We've reached the end of this talk, and we talked about the Apollo client and how to set up the Apollo client with a React application. We learned about queries, the use query hook, and we also talked about mutations using the use mutation hooks. And if you'd like to learn in depth more about this topic, I do have a course on Pluralsight, another one, which is the Consuming GraphQL API with Apollo Client and React, where I talk about all of the stuff we just did and more. It's a 2-hour course which goes in length and depth about this topic. And I also use the same Globomantics app, so you can have reference to that. And I'd like to say thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today, All Things Open. It was a pleasure that I could, actually make it happen. If you'd like to follow me, I'm on Twitter at Adhithi Ravi, and I'm quite active there if you want to keep in touch, have questions. But with that, I'll open the floor to questions. If you need me to answer some questions, I'm available right now. Thank you so much, All Things Open.
Thanks, Adhithi. It was really wonderful. Starting session for the Developer 3 track. And thanks everyone for attending today. Yeah, I think we can just wait for a couple of more minutes for participants to throw their questions. You can use your Q&A tab or unmute yourself or raise your hand, and I can unmute you if you want to ask a direct question to Adhithi. Thanks, Adhithi, again.
Sure. I don't think I see any questions.
Yeah, I don't see either. Let's wait.
And if you'd like to have the link to the repository, I can send that here. That way, do I just send it in the chat?
Yes.
Okay. So that has all of the code we talked about and some more. And I do have examples of how we can update the cache for complex mutations in that.
Are there any big examples or case studies that you are currently working on with the same with Apollo?
Sorry, what's that?
Like recent big examples or case studies that you're working on with Apollo for some clients or
right now for clients, I'm not doing a lot of GraphQL. We're doing some TypeScript React projects. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You had a lot of appreciation for your presentation, clear presentation, and examples that you presented from the audience.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.